A Chris Craft boat was never a small object in American memory. It was polished wood chrome hardware, a steering wheel under the sun, and an engine note moving across a lake on a summer afternoon. But in February 1989, the company's story reached a stranger place. A buyer paid about $58 million for Chris Craft's physical assets, the factories, the tooling, the equipment, and the workers attached to them, but not the name. The name printed on the boats still belonged somewhere else. To use it, the new builder had to pay $500,000 a year, plus 1% of every Chris Craft boat sale. A company that once helped define recreational boating in America had reached the point where the people building the boats were renting the identity on the hull. To understand how that happened, the story has to go back before the trademark, before the showrooms, before the celebrity owners. It starts with waterwood and a 13-foot skiff onto the St. Clair River. In 1874, Christopher Columbus Smith was 13 years old. He and his brother Henry built a flat-bottom skiff on the edge of the St. Clair River in Algonac, Michigan. It was about 13 feet long, no engine, no cabin, no polished name on the side. It was built for shallow water duck marshes and work that had to be done close to the river. That mattered. A boat in Algonac was not a decoration. It was a tool. It had to carry weight, sit correctly in the current move through marsh water, and come back in one piece. Chris Smith learned the first version of boat building through use, not through branding. By 1881, the demand had become steady enough for the brothers to make it official. Smith Brothers Boat Builders opened as a small boathouse on the Algonac waterfront. Then the gasoline engine arrived. In the late 1890s, engines began showing up in small boats, and they changed the problem immediately. A hull that worked with oars or a pole did not automatically work with a heavy motor inside it. The weight shifted. The balance changed. At speed, the boat could slap against the water instead of cutting through it. In the worst cases, it could become dangerous. Chris Smith started testing hull shapes, weight placement, and deeper forms that could handle power without losing stability. The work was physical. Build, launch, watch, adjust, build again. Before Chris Craft became a brand, it was a repeated answer to one question. What does the water demand from the boat? By 1910, the answer had attracted a man named Garfield Arthur Wood. Garwood wanted racing hulls, and he wanted them built by the best hands he could find. Smith built for him. The Baby Gar racing boats brought orders attention and enough work to hire around 30 men. But the arrangement carried pressure. Smith's shop handled the skilled labor. Smith's men absorbed the schedule. Smith's business carried the cost of getting each hull right. Garwood received the public glory when the boats won. The split between the two men was more than a personal break. It showed Chris Smith the limit of being someone else's builder. If the boat carried his work eventually, it would need to carry his name. By 1922, the Smith family needed shoreline. The old boathouse could prove skill, but it could not carry the next version of the company. That year, the family bought 20 acres of riverfront land at Point Duchesne in Algonac. The location did part of the work for them. Lumber could arrive by water. Finished boats could be launched into the St. Clair River without a long trip by road. The factory was not separate from the river. It was arranged around it. Inside, the work still began with wood. Philippine mahogany came in as planks, not as a finished promise. Before cutters touched it, pattern makers translated drawings into full-size physical templates. Every curve had to become something a worker could place against a board. Every angle had to survive the distance between paper and hull. Then the cutter shaped the pieces. The frames went together, the planks followed. Chris Craft hulls used double plank construction with 2 layers of mahogany laid in opposing directions. The method gave the hull strength without making it unnecessarily heavy. But it also demanded judgment. Wood expanded when wet and contracted when dry. Leave the gap too wide and water found its way in. Fit it too tight and the hull could fight itself when the planks swelled. The margin was small, A worker covered bronze screws with small mahogany bungs. Another sanded the surface. Another laid down varnish, waited for it to cure, and sanded again. The shine that people later associated with Chris Craft was not a mood. It was labor repeated in layers. By the middle of the 1920s, the Smiths were not only changing how boats were built, they were changing who could imagine owning one. In 1926, the company moved beyond selling mainly from the factory and built a national dealer network. A buyer no longer needed to travel to Algonac or belong to a narrow circle of wealthy boat owners. A buyer could walk into a regional showroom, sit inside the product, touch the wheel, and understand the distance between wanting a boat and arranging to buy one. In 1927, Chris Craft made that distance smaller with installment financing. The Cadet, a 22-foot runabout, could be bought through a 12-month payment plan with local banks. The boat moved from fantasy to household arithmetic. It became a line on a budget, not only a prize at the end of inherited wealth. That decision changed the pressure inside the company. More buyers meant more models. More models meant more patterns, more hardware, more engines, more dealer promises that had to be kept. After World War II, those pieces came together with unusual force. Wartime contracts had taught the company how to produce at scale use plywood methods and meet deadlines under inspection. Civilian customers returned to a company that now understood volume better than it had before the war. By the 1950s, Chris Craft offered 159 different models: runabouts, utilities, cruisers, houseboats. The company had factories in multiple states. Algonac High School even taught boat building from 1947 into the early 1960s because the local economy had made the skill practical enough for a classroom. At that point, Chris Craft was more than a boat name. It was a factory floor, a dealer network, a school curriculum, a river town, and a customer standing in a showroom believing the object in front of him could belong to his life. The stronger that connection became, the harder it would be to change. When the buyer began asking for a different kind of boat, a wooden Chris Craft did not stop asking for attention after the sale. The owner took delivery, but the work continued. The hull had to be watched. The varnish had to be protected. The boat needed storage, seasonal care, and people who understood what water could do to wood. That had once been part of the appeal. A mahogany boat rewarded the owner who cared for it. The surface held light. The deck carried the marks of craft. The smell of varnish and wood belonged to the experience. But by the 1950s, a different buyer was entering the water. This buyer still wanted weekend speed and a boat that looked right at the dock. But he did not always want the maintenance schedule that came with a wooden hull. He did not want the same annual ritual of sanding, sealing, checking seams, and worrying about weather. Fiberglass offered a different promise. A fiberglass hull did not swell and contract like wood. It did not ask for the same yearly varnish work. It could stay in the water longer with less attention. For a growing middle-class customer, that mattered as much as the shine. Chris Craft saw the material early. In 1955, the company introduced the Cobra, its first fiberglass boat. The knowledge was there. The warning was there. But the old center of gravity remained mahogany-skilled woodwork, varnished decks, and the customer memory built around them. The problem was not that Chris Craft knew nothing about the future. The problem was that the future asked the company to change what made it recognizable. Competitors had fewer attachments to protect. Sea Ray, Glastron, Grumman, and others could build a round fiberglass from the beginning. Their buyers compared price, upkeep, convenience, and time. A boat that required less care could feel more useful than a boat with more tradition behind it. The dealer now had a harder job. He was no longer only selling finish, shape, and reputation. He had to explain why the older promise still justified more work. He had to sell the feeling of mahogany to a customer who was starting to count the hours required to maintain it. By 1960, Chris Craft was still respected. It was not a failed company. The name still carried weight. The boats still had buyers, but the comparison had shifted. The product that once made the company feel within reach was beginning to feel demanding. And just as the customer was changing, the people above the factory were about to change too. In 1960, the Smith family sold Chris Craft to Manafi Corporation. The company was not being sold from a position of collapse. The boats still had a place in American marinas. The name still meant something to customers. The factory knowledge was still alive in the workers, the patterns, the dealers, and the old river town that had grown around the product. But the sale changed the room where decisions were made. NAFI did not begin as a boat company. It came from automotive fibers, upholstery carpeting, and interior trim for the car industry. Those were real manufacturing businesses, but they carried a different relationship to the product. A boat was not just a component. It was a finished object with memory attached to its surface. By 1962, NAFI had renamed itself Chris Craft Industries. That detail matters. The boat company had become large enough that its name could now cover businesses beyond boats. The name was useful outside the factory. It could sit on a corporate letterhead, not only on a hull. The distance kept growing. In 1968, Baldwin Montrose Chemical Company took a controlling interest. Herbert Siegel moved into the chairman's role. The people at the top were now farther from the old shop floor in Algonac, farther from the wood patterns, farther from the dealer, trying to explain why a customer should still choose the older promise. By the late 1970s, the parent company was looking in a different direction entirely. In 1977, Chris Craft Industries began buying stock in 20th Century Fox. By 1979, it owned about 20% of the studio and attempted a full takeover. When that failed, the company later traded the Fox stake for shares in United Television. The boat name was now attached to media deals, stock positions, and boardroom calculations that had very little to do with a hole in the water. That did not mean every decision was careless. A corporate owner can look at a slow-changing product line and see real constraints, labor, materials, competition, capital, and buyers who are drifting toward easier ownership. But the pressure on the product was no longer being answered from inside the craft that created it. In 1981, that distance became formal. Chris Craft Industries sold the boat manufacturing division to a private investment group led by George Dale Murray. The factories, the tooling, the workers, and the active boat operation moved to the new owner. The trademark did not. The Chris Craft name stayed with the parent company and was licensed back to the people making the boats. From that point forward, the company building Chris Craft boats no longer fully owned the identity it was trying to repair. Murray did try to bring attention back to the product. In 1984, Murray Chris Craft introduced the Chris Cat 300, a racing catamaran with twin engines producing roughly 400 to 420 horsepower each. That same year, 5 Stinger 390X boats appeared in the first season of Miami Vice, 39 feet of fiberglass, and speed moving through the Florida sun. For a moment, the name was visible again. Revenue reached about $120 million in 1984 and about $180 million in 1986. From the outside, the comeback looked possible, but visibility did not settle the deeper problem. The company still had leadership conflict, a crowded market, material expectations it had not fully resolved, and a name that had become a contract. A boat could appear on television. A factory still had to make the numbers work. In the second half of 1988, the loss was no longer hidden inside strategy. Murray Chris Craft was losing about $2 million every month. Interest rates had risen. Credit had tightened. Boats were expensive enough to require financing, and customers were becoming more careful about signing for discretionary purchases. A boat that once represented a rival now had to pass through a loan officer's desk. On December 9, 1988, Murray Chris Craft filed for bankruptcy. The filing turned years of pressure into a court process. The racing comeback had not been enough. The television visibility had not been enough. The revenue numbers from the middle of the decade had not become a stable route forward. In February 1989, the auction moved the physical company again. Outboard Marine Corporation, the parent behind Johnson and Evinrude outboard engines, paid about $58 million for the assets. The manufacturing facilities in Bradenton, Florida, Goshen, Indiana, and Swansboro, North Carolina, moved with the deal. So did tooling equipment and the working pieces needed to keep production alive. But the name still sat outside the purchase. OMC had to pay $500,000 a year plus 1% of Chris Craft boat sales for the right to put that name on the products it was now responsible for building. The old fracture had become an operating cost. Under OMC, Chris Craft moved toward broader distribution and lower price points. That may have made sense on a spreadsheet. More boats could spread fixed costs across more units. A lower price could reach more buyers. But every move toward volume placed new pressure on the name. Customers who remembered the older boats were comparing the product in front of them with the product they carried in memory. The gap was not always visible in a brochure. It appeared in finish, feel, service, and trust. For 11 straight years, the boat division failed to produce a profitable year. In 2000, OMC filed for bankruptcy. This time, the shutdown reached the name itself. Chris Craft production stopped for nearly 9 months. No showroom comeback, no racing headline, no television glare. Just a famous name waiting in a bankruptcy estate separated from the old river town that had made it valuable in the first place. In 2001, the name and the physical pieces finally came back under one owner. Stelican Limited bought the Chris Craft trademark from News Corporation for roughly $5 million. It bought the remaining physical assets from the OMC bankruptcy estate for roughly another $5 million. For the first time in 20 years, the name on the hull and the company building the boat were no longer separated by a licensing agreement. That did not bring Algonac back. The revival happened in a different place for a different buyer with a different manufacturing base. The new Chris Craft would not chase volume first. It would build fewer boats at higher prices with enough physical detail to make the old name credible again. In 2006, Chris Craft returned to the Miami International Boat Show with 4 new models. The hulls were fiberglass now built through a hand lamination process. The boot stripe was molded into the body instead of painted on afterward. The paintwork alone could take around 50 hours per boat. Teak replaced the old mahogany in many interior surfaces. The past was not copied. It was translated. By the late 2000s, the average selling price sat around $200,000. Most buyers paid cash. A quarter of sales went overseas. In 2018, Winnebago Industries bought Chris Craft and kept the Sarasota operation in place. Then in 2024, Chris Craft marked 150 years with the Launch 27 Anniversary Edition. A modern boat, a modern company, a name that had been separated, licensed, paused, and rebuilt. But the old river town was no longer the center of it. On the hull, the script still catches the light.